Lauren, when we think about satellites looking down on the surface of the ocean, we can imagine they could be useful for the colour of the ocean, or these big large-scale properties. How on earth can something as far away as a satellite have anything to do with where a marine mammal is?
Well, it's not necessarily always that clear, because if you are looking at a top predator, for example, it's not necessarily going to be eating phytoplankton, which is what you're measuring when you're measuring the colour of the ocean. So you'd anticipate that there'll be a lag, whether it's in time or in space, because they're going to be eating maybe the zooplankton that feed on the phytoplankton, or they're going to be eating the fish that eat the zooplankton that eat the phytoplankton, or they're going to be eating the squid that eat the fish that eat the zooplankton that eat the phytoplankton. So you're going to anticipate spatial or temporal lags. The thing is, during my PhD, I was expecting exactly this when I was looking at the movement patterns of southern elephant seals that had been tagged relative to the biogeochemical data that they were collecting on the presence of phytoplankton. And I was very surprised instead to find that their behavior was in fact not independent of these things. So even though there is a lag, we cannot just out of hand say that the two are unrelated, which is both surprising and also very interesting. So from that stage, we can start to understand even top marine predators as sentinel species, so they can stand as indicators of ecosystem health. Because if you've got the bottom of the food web, the base of the marine food web, and the top of the marine food web, if you're able to study those two things, there are things that you can infer about everything else in between. Obviously, you can't measure fish from satellite, but you need to start to look for the things that tend to be where the fish are. And from that, you can start to infer all of the stages in between.
So tell me about an elephant seal. What sort of lifestyle does it live, and how do you know where it is?
Okay, so southern elephant seals are amazing creatures.
They're enormous. I've seen them. They're gigantic.
The males are gigantic. So they're one of the most sexually dimorphic creatures on the planet. And what that means is the males and the females are completely different in size. And that's quite common with species that aren't monogamous. But it's extreme with elephant seals. So the males get to about 4 tons. They're absolutely gigantic. They tend to be beach masters. And then they'll have a harem of smaller adult female elephant seals. But actually, that's kind of the less impressive thing about them, because that's when they're on land, and they're hardly ever on land. They come onto land to breed and to wean their babies, and they come onto land to molt. And cumulatively, that's perhaps several weeks. The rest of the time, they're in one of the most hostile oceans on the planet, and they're very comfortable in those waters. So after they've had their breeding season on the subantarctic islands like Kerguelen or South Georgia or Marion Island, they get back into the water, and they have 3 months within which to put on all of the weight that they lost while they were starving themselves on land. So they tend to have to double their body weight again in that very short period of time. So they have this imperative to really be very successful at foraging, to be very successful predators. And as a result, when we're following their movement patterns, we're learning a lot about the biology of the ocean, because they can't mess around, they don't have time, because they have to get back to the island in order to molt. And what they do when they molt is they basically get rid of their summer skin and they get on new sleek skin, and that's what they survive the winter in. So it's 8 months at sea, under the most extreme conditions, right next to the ice edge, middle of winter, there's hardly any light. It's obviously freezing in the water, and they manage to be very successful.
So how do you know where they are?
So I don't get to do this, but cool biologists get to go to these subantarctic islands, and while they're looking at the animals for their own reasons, so measuring their health, looking at their weight, and they kindly glue a small tag about the size of my hand called salinity, temperature, and conductivity satellite relay data logger. They stick that to the head of the elephant seal, and it comes off when the seal molts. Remember, I spoke about that molting process. But while they're on the seal, every time the seal comes to the surface to breathe, which is for a very short period of time actually. The seals come to the surface for about 2 to 3 minutes at a time. The rest of the time they're diving really quite routinely, quite deeply. They can go up to 2 kilometers depth. So they're really incredible animals to have these sorts of instruments on. And when they come to the surface, the aerial on the tag sticks out and sends the data to a satellite. And from there, I can comfortably sit at my computer where I'm not in the Southern Ocean and download the data and know where they are in space and time. And not just that, but what they saw while they were deep under the ocean.
And so these are measurements that oceanographers have taken for years off ships. You dangle basically the devices over the side on elaborate bits of string. You take the measurements all the way down and all the way back up again, and then you've got the measurement in one place. But the elephant seals are moving around and then sending all that data home via these satellites.
The other thing that's quite cool about the seals that I said, I alluded to earlier, is they have this imperative, right, to go and find fish or squid. The thing about oceanographers is that we're human. And so we decide where we're going to stop and take those measurements. But is that really the best place to take a measurement? So elephant seals are going to interesting places because they have to go to these interesting places. And they're collecting data in areas that we have to infer are going to be very biologically interesting. Whether they're oceanographically interesting or not is less important in a way, and this is a bit controversial, but it's because it's one of the most undersampled oceans in the world. So we suffer from a paucity of data there anyway. So wherever they are, the fact that they're collecting data continuously for months at a time means that we are grateful for all of the data that they give us back. The other thing is that the tags don't necessarily always just have salinity, temperature, and pressure sensors. We can also add things like fluorometers, oxygen sensors, and light meters. So we can measure how light is attenuated in the water column, which is actually an amazing thing to know because it can tell you so many things about turbidity, also about phytoplankton, and also about the amount of light that's reaching the surface of the ocean. And obviously the Southern Ocean doesn't receive very much light during the winter months. It's considered a light limited regime. And in summer there's so much light, it can almost be considered a light stressed regime. So the whole system is really, it has a really love-hate relationship with light. So it's quite important to measure this. The other thing about fluorescence is that's what phytoplankton do. They fluoresce when you bombard them with light. So you can actually measure phytoplankton in the water, and as well as oxygen. Now these are really good because you get lots of measurements. We've got about a 7 or 8 year time series now where these seals have been routinely tagged. But ultimately, as much as we have lots of measurements, they are still just point measurements. And the most powerful thing I think that one can do with these sorts of data is then to compare them with satellite data. And you can say, right, the elephant seal was here in space and time and it measured this amount of light, it measured this amount of phytoplankton. What does the satellite say it saw? And let's compare it and see if they're actually speaking the same language.
So when it comes to validation, which is something we've talked about a little bit, how do you check that the satellites are measuring what you think they're measuring? An elephant seal can help with that because it's just there in this place where it's very hard to get humans.
Exactly.
And it can make those measurements.
Yeah, and it can be there during some of the most hostile months where you cannot get a ship. And it can be there in waters that are ice covered where you cannot send Argo floats. So they're just there routinely doing their thing, collecting data in places that we literally cannot get to. So it's quite extraordinary.
And if you want to get at biodiversity and to understand ecosystems, the elephant seals are doing a lot of the work for you because they're, like you said, they want to find the fish. So they go to where the fish are. You don't have to sample all these different places to find out where the fish are. The elephant seals will find them, and then you get all of these measurements, all these diverse measurements right in the middle of the productive areas.
Well, that's what you hope. You would think that an animal that is so dependent on being in biologically rich areas is going to target those areas. And we're able to sort of infer these sorts of things by looking at their movement patterns. So there's something called area restricted search and they'll be walking, and there are different ways that we can infer where areas are biologically rich and where they're just traveling. So it's not a perfect science, obviously. We're using proxies like that we gather from their behavior. But yes, absolutely, they're doing the work for us. And that's not to say that in situ measurements from ships are not important. It's just that they're really good oceanographers and they're complementing the work that we do.